Do you think that in externalizing our intelligence and improving it, if it's possible as well, beyond human intelligence, that we're then making ourselves maybe second-class beings to our own creation?
That's a really good question. Actually, I really like that. I think that's a very philosophical, abstract question. I do like that. This is something that a lot of people in philosophy and in this field have spoken about, and it's one that's hard to answer.
Hi everyone, my name is Hawker Zafer, and this is Redefining AI. Redefining AI, it's a podcast hosted by Squirrel and the Squirrel Academy. The podcast focuses on key narratives and discussions that drive digital innovation and help people understand artificial intelligence, machine learning, insight engines, and the insight era. Now, today I'm really happy to welcome Oriana Medlicott. Now, Oriana is a senior researcher in the technology strategy unit at Fujitsu, and she's a co-host of the Let's Chat Ethics podcast. Now, as a senior researcher, she contributes to shaping the technology strategy through technology market analysis and research, finding startups to partner with, as well as organising events and external partnerships to promote research and development in areas such as AI ethics, digital twin, data and security, and many more. As someone who is passionate about making technology accessible and ethical, prior to her current role, Oriana worked as an AI ethics consultant in the US and Europe. Before she joins us though, I want to lift the veil and invite you to take your first steps with us into the space of AI and ethics. Just a few years ago, discussions of data ethics and AI ethics were mostly reserved for non-profit organisations and passionate academics. Today though, global tech companies like Facebook, Twitter, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, and many more are creating dedicated and fast-growing teams to tackle the multitude of ethical problems that arise from the far-reaching collection, analysis, and use of huge troves of data, particularly and well-knownly in the field of machine learning models, namely AI. These companies are investing in answers to once mystical ethical questions, because they've realized quite simply that failing to operationalize data and AI ethics is a threat to their bottom line. Not doing this can expose companies to reputational, regulatory, and legal risks, but that's only the beginning. Failing to operationalize data and AI ethics also leads to wasted resources, inefficiencies in product development and deployment, and even an inability to use data to train AI models at all. Now, the topic and space is fascinating, and it can be explored from so many different angles. So let's start finding out more from someone who spent many years exploring those angles already. Welcome, Oriana.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that long introduction. I was really, really keen to hear what you were saying about ethical AI and, like you were saying, the backgrounds to it and where it is today. I think it's been a very fast-moving field and fast-moving topic. And I think this is way more in the limelight now than it was just even a few years ago. So it's interesting to even have these conversations on podcasts like yourself and, in now forums such as workshops and panels. I think a lot of people want to hear about this subject compared to even 5 years ago when it was kind of not in the spotlight at all.
Definitely. And let's go from the present to the past a little bit, Oriana. So where are you on your own journey, and how did you end up here, or how did you end up there?
So I guess it's maybe a more non-traditional route into tech per se and the job I'm doing now. So my background, I studied history as an undergrad with philosophy, and then I got really interested in the philosophy of technology when I was doing my undergraduate. So I decided to continue on and do a master's in philosophy again. And I was really with my professor at the time, kind of debating which direction to take my thesis on. And he cleverly said that, the future is AI and technology. Definitely focus your thesis on that, because I'm sure one day it will influence the work you do or the job you have. And obviously, when you're a student as well, sometimes it's hard to think way into the future about your career, especially when you're studying something like history and philosophy that doesn't have a one route to a job. So I decided to look at the effects of biotechnology and artificial intelligence on human nature, specifically looking at the ethics of both biotech and AI. Obviously, there's a lot more, and there was a lot more at the time, literature on biotechnology and the ethics, because everyone knows a lot more about bioethics compared to maybe AI ethics even then. And I got really interested in, maybe kind of the abstract ideas of, can you download a machine into a human brain into the machine, and could robots or computers ever actually have human intelligence, which was kind of very abstract in many ways, but I got very interested in those topics. And then when I finished, quite honestly, there wasn't any 9-to-5 job in this field at all, as you can imagine. A lot of people were just like, what is this? And what do you want to do? And I didn't really feel at the time that I wanted to continue in academia. I felt like a PhD at the time didn't feel like the right path for me. So I got into the business world, was working in HR and operational roles, always knew they weren't really for me. And I, in the background, was constantly keeping up to date with what was happening in AI and tech. And I moved to New York, and I knew that if you can make it anywhere, it will be in the US or in New York. So I just started networking a lot and finding, think tanks and people that were having conversations in AI, tech, ethics, and started to find different communities that were, and kind of just pitched myself as a freelancer. Can I, do a workshop for you? Can I do some research for you? Can I talk to you about this? And from there, I kind of built a network and started doing my own freelance work in AI ethics throughout the US and then Europe. And then that's ultimately what led me to my job at Fujitsu. But along the way, I started a podcast as well, actually, with a friend. We were co-hosting a podcast called Let's Chat Ethics, where we discuss different topics. And she's coming from the computer science angle, and I'm coming from the philosophy angle. So it's kind of nice to have both different outlooks on AI. So that's kind of a fast and long story to how I kind of got to where I am today. But it's been a really interesting journey, because it's enabled me to work with loads of different really fascinating and clever people in different areas who are interested in making, I guess, technology safer and more accessible.
Excellent. I mean, it sounds fascinating. I mean, you've sort of highlighted or trying to paint a wonderful and inviting picture about the roads that you've travelled personally that have led you to this point. I have to go back, I think, and actually touch upon philosophy and technology. Philosophy and technology. It sounds extremely inviting, but what does it cover, philosophy and technology?
So I guess it's looking at those questions about approaching the ways we think about technology. I guess it's a way you understand yourself and how that's approached. Like I was saying, thinking of intelligence and human intelligence, and can that be compared to the intelligence of technology? Artificial intelligence is what we call it. So I think a lot of people put a lot of I guess maybe dreams and hopes on AI that is going to conquer and take over the world in a positive way, and going to solve all humanity's problems, and giving it that kind of maybe far too much placement on our understanding of intelligence. So I think, like philosophy anyway, there is no right or wrong way to address life questions, but I think it brings a lot of the life questions and human questions to technology in what you could say good and both negative ways.
Definitely. I mean, there's probably multiple parallels that we can explore, but I also want to touch upon, I mean, there's probably a parallel that you've had to split yourself between, of like being a philosopher or an someone that's more aligned from an ethical perspective, or maybe you don't sort of split yourself. Where do your own obligations or moral compass lie in that sense?
I feel like philosophy for me was I've met up with my professor recently. He said that I like to ask the tough questions a lot of the time, or put people. He was like, "Oh, I remember putting me on the spot, or asking maybe some of the tougher things of why people do things they do, or why things are the way they are." And I think that's why I liked philosophy, because it's a lot of questioning of, well, why should it be like this? Should we not shape it this way? Or thinking outside the box a bit more, because I think sometimes people think that philosophy doesn't, or the skills you learn don't relate to maybe business skills, but they do, because it's a lot of ways of thinking, critical thought, that you have to apply, I think, in business. And I don't find myself having to necessarily split that. I think I've had my morals, I guess, from probably shaped from a lot of us have our family and friends and the people around us, and then the society that you're brought up in definitely influences what you believe is right and wrong. And then I found that philosophy just helped me think a bit more critically, instead of taking everything like as is, oh, okay, that's just the way it is. It's thinking, well, why was it made that way, or why does it have to be that way? So who could that potentially be affecting? And just going a bit more debating of things, which I think is ultimately what a lot of AI ethics has led to, is questions of the end user of right or wrong, and then thinking, well, just because it was designed like this in the past and it benefited X amount of people, why can't it be done differently now? So I hope that wasn't too much of a tangent, but
No,
to get into a philosophy hole.
Not at all. I mean, I think my own head's going down a philosophy or a philosophical rabbit hole as well. And
I think that
I think it's something as well that you probably explored quite a lot. I mean, you mentioned that you've got your show called Let's Chat Ethics, and you focus a lot on the discourse around ethical AI. And I think I also read that you explore it from maybe two contrasting discourse and angles, namely sort of the humanities against techies and the responsible philosophers against the mad scientists. And I think you're trying to bring, from what you mentioned, a more balanced view of a variety of topics surrounding ethics and tech. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is kind of so Amanda and my co-host and I, well, we kind of laugh because it should be her versus I's, and she's come from the technical computer science background. I've come from more humanities philosophy backgrounds, and it is more traditionally that it's kind of been computer scientists think, oh, philosophy is a waste of time. They're all kind of crazy, and then philosophers think, oh my god, computer scientists are ruining the world. They don't care about anyone but themselves. Like this kind of pitching each other against each other. But actually I found that a lot of the time Amanda and I end up having a lot of the same opinions when it comes to AI ethics. We actually have the same outlook really on most of the problems that arise in tech, and that's why we try to bring it a bit more balance, because she has got that much more deeper technical knowledge that she's been actually working with natural language processing and data sense practically for years. But yeah, I've also able to bring in the ethical side and looking at what problems could arise, could they think of doing something differently, those kind of things. And we've brought on guests as well that have different backgrounds as well, that aren't just one or the other, people who have got different balanced views, because I think that's important when you're looking at AI ethics. It's not just philosophy and computer science either. There's so many more I guess stakeholders that would be involved in this anyway.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because you always try to maybe, and I probably imagine that you did that together, look at how it comes to maybe a common understanding or a common interpretation of what is ethical around AI. Maybe before we go too deeper into the conversation, I mean, we're talking a lot about ethics, what could be possibly classified as ethical AI or what's important there. What would you say you're focusing on from your perspective in the reach that we're sort of defining when we're talking about ethics, ethical and AI?
Yeah, I think because it's important when you look at ethics, put in, I guess, context of where you're from as well, because there's going to be different understanding of, I guess, right and wrong and good and bad and what's ethical and not, depending on your cultural backgrounds. You know, we in Europe can have a different understanding necessarily than China, and that's very obvious when it comes to even a lot of regulation to do with AI, how it's viewed is differently, and things that we here might think are, you know, wrong, someone in China might think is fine, and they might think what we're doing is wrong. So it's important, I think, that's why a lot of the conversation at the moment is to open up more of a worldwide narrative. But a lot of the conversation also is there ever going to be a point where worldwide we can all come to a consensus on ethical understanding of technologies? I think there's certain things we can all agree is completely wrong, i.e. if a technology or an AI causes direct harm, such as, you know, death, like with the autonomous driving car. I think that's something that worldwide they can agree on. But then it's, you know, it's other things that become a bit more, I guess, murky waters that it's harder for people to necessarily agree on. So I think the work I do is interesting, and the work my company do, because again, it's a Japanese company, but so it might be argued that we could be Japanese perspective on AI ethics, but I think it's more of a way more cultural nuances, because, you know, the Fujitsu covers worldwide. They have offices everywhere, so it's important for Fujitsu's AI ethics to reflect everyone that works there, as well as you know, the business they're doing in different countries.
And do you find that a lot of these cultural nuances, I mean, obviously we're talking about maybe background, and I mean, ethics pertains to a set of moral principles or a form of conduct, and we can say that it is maybe, and again, I think that leads down another philosophical debate of nature and nurture, and how you embody ethics, and I suppose that's different in a business setting as well. Have you noticed that there's identifiable nuances for certain cultures that you see parallels with other cultures, or is it just slight?
Oh, I would say, I think that, I mean, I would say that ethics in Europe and the US seem to be more aligned. Like there's a bit more nuances, and I think there's more agreement in, you know, how things should be done. I mean, take away regulation, because I think regulation is obviously very different in Europe versus the US when it comes to AI and tech. But I think when it comes to the AI ethics kind of principles and guidelines, they do see a lot of, I guess, cultural values align. But then I guess it's because the USA is, you know, largely got a big European population that's migrated there over the years. So I think that makes sense as to why, you know, the cultural and ethical values have got those similarities. But yeah, just to use China again, I think as China's an obvious one in terms of just the differences in approach to, I guess, technologies even such as facial recognition, where it's widely more accepted in China, and it's part of kind of everyday life now, but it's openly part of everyday life, whereas I think it's got more of a negative outlook in the US and in Europe on facial recognition. That's reflected in policies and regulation. But we still have it here. It's maybe just a bit more, it's not as open about it, which is, I guess, an interesting subject in itself.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that I was going to actually follow up in there, because I think that if we're looking at the development, you've mentioned facial recognition, which is obviously one. I mean, we're talking about different branches of maybe computer vision and different emerging techs that a lot of the larger organizations, smaller organizations as well, are using. I think that, you know, worldwide it is difficult to maybe set a framework that would adhere to cultural practices and morals, but I think that when you mentioned there, we're looking at things like transparency, accessibility, explainability, inclusiveness, alignment. How far do you feel that the field is in terms of everything that I've highlighted there and obligations, maybe from an AI development perspective?
I feel like if we go back a bit, I think it's come a long way. So from my perspective, I think even, which to me is quite a short space of time, really. That I finished my master's in 2015, and now we're in 2022, and then there wasn't really there were barely any guidelines. There wasn't really what you see now at all. And then in 2022, I think the OECD reported, I think there's over 60 countries worldwide have guidelines and principles and policies to do with AI ethics. And I can't remember what the exact guidelines, but there was a huge amount of guidelines and policies now on AI ethics and those principles that you were specifically mentioning. And I do think actively worldwide, everyone is really in, whether that's public sector, private sector, I think they are actively trying to embed ethics into a lot of the work. Now, that's not saying it's perfect, because I still think that there is a long way to go. And there's, people make criticisms such as ethics washing and how true are people when there is it publicity stunt, basically. But I do think that from my perspective, I think it's come a long way, and there's a lot of positive work being done. Even in academia now, there's loads of amazing work being done in this space. And I think there's still a lot to go, and it will take a while to align. I think, like you're saying, it is a new field realistically, so it's not going to be perfect, and it's going to take a while to align within private sector, public sector, and academia. But I think it's on the right track. But obviously, there's always going to be, unfortunately, pitfalls, like we've seen with different scandals that have happened coming out of companies and things like that.
And you definitely don't want people jumping on the bandwagon, as you've mentioned, of doing ethics just for the sake of ethics. I mean, I think that if there is that conscious investment, that there should be these ethical obligations that are set so that there is the fair development of AI.
Mm-hmm.
If we look at the development, though, and everything that's produced or being produced in the space that pertains to an ethical obligation, I mean, we think a lot about, and it's publicized quite a lot in the press, about AI algorithms and, training data, and that these are the main cause of maybe unethic sort of sources. Or, I mean, they may contain biases, as we go down the philosophical route of humans contain biases. I mean, and these are generated by humans. And these biases, they sort of prevent the AI systems from making a lot of maybe fair decisions that we've sort of inexplicitly referenced there. What are the reasons then for encountering biases in AI systems?
I think, yeah, like you were touching on there, I think the problem is when it comes to bias and bias algorithms or data sets, or people accusing, again, I think facial recognition is a good example, but not being able to detect darker skin tones, or wrongly detecting people with darker skin tones because it hasn't been trained on the correct data. So I think that it's easy to blame facial recognition, but actually you should be blaming really this human behind this at the end of the day, and the data is picked by humans. So this trained on data, and that was decided by humans. So I think it really goes down to the human element of bias, like you were saying. If there's bias in a human, they're going to have bias when they're choosing the data, which is going to be then fed into the system, which then is going to, the output will unfortunately be biased. I don't think we can ever get to a place of no bias, because I think unfortunately in society there's always going to be bias in everything we do. I think that's kind of part of human nature, but we can get to a point where it's actually making it way more equal and fair. So i.e., if you have a team that's more diverse, you are going to have less likely to have those decisions, because I think, as we know, tech has predominantly been very male and white orientated for years, and it still is. So I think if you've got more diverse teams, you're going to have more likely to be like, hey, we should have training data that involves people from different ethnic backgrounds involved when we're doing this for facial recognition. So I think it's important to build teams that are diverse, as well as, I think, training. So I think training is important as well, as part of the process. Just like in HR, you have kind of diversity and inclusion training, and there are lots of different trainings that you're given in the workplace. I think bias training when it comes to data should be part of it, as well as, giving that kind of overall ethical AI training, which is looking at all the things that can happen when you're using these systems.
I mean, I completely agree, and I think it's definitely a good idea to ensure that there is the offering of bias training. But do you not think that it is more of a subconscious movement? I mean, do you think that you can really target that sort of bias or minimization of biases through bias reduction from a perspective of training? I mean, just thinking about, like, as you mentioned, the human psyche. And I think that I would agree that, in a sense, that I don't think you can fully eradicate or stop the inclusion, because we are human. But I'm just thinking about more of really being able to address that subconscious arising of bringing biases in.
I mean, yeah, yes and no. I do think bias training is important, because there are many things. If you live in your own self, which we all do, we all have our own, I guess, privileges as people, whether that's, a white privilege or abled privilege, or even just having money as a privilege, and that's obviously been your view and understanding of the world and landscape. So I think it's very, you can't even necessarily blame people that they might not have thought that something affects someone from a different background in a different way, and that could in turn affect how you train data. So I do think you train models with data. So I do think that bias training is actually quite important. I've known, even for myself, just reading different books that have been from, not necessarily in philosophy or tech, but have been about different people's lives and the way they've had to navigate the world, open my eyes up to how different my life has been and what bias I might have had in my way of thinking. So I do think even if it's something small that you may not have thought of, but going to certain bias training actually can really open people's eyes to the way things are done. Like I said, it's never going to completely eradicate, because fortunately, I don't think we live in a perfect world, and I don't think we ever will. But I think that there can be steps that companies can do to ensure that the people that work for them are making the right choices.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's that I would certainly fully support what you've said there. Do we only need to look at the human? Do you think that there's any flaws in the development of the technology, which is a sort of roundabout skewed question as well, because obviously humans are developing the technology, but is the problem with the human?
Okay, that is. I mean, yes, I think you would argue that. Yeah, ultimately, yes, because I think the human is the one designing or developing or deploying the technology. So unfortunately, yes, it would be. I mean, I don't like to say the problem is the human, because I think we all, when it comes to like models or training models, everyone's going to make mistakes, aren't they? I think that's part of, again, human nature, and part of the way the world is. We're all going to make mistakes, and that's another thing. I don't think that necessarily every model, any type of technology that's come to the market has necessarily been an outward, someone's tried to cause harm, or someone's completely biased, even though there are cases of that. Yes, I think there's also just people making human error and human mistake, which is a common part of what we talk about in AI ethics, is like human error and the different elements that causes, and people saying that there needs to be human oversight on technology, which there does. But again, humans are always going to make mistakes. So unfortunately, there will always be flaws with technology, like there will with anything we design, because we're always going to kind of, it's trial and error in many ways, but like there are definitely steps that can be taken to improve.
Yeah, and I think that a lot, not only the public sector, but in the private sector, they've gone through the experience of really finding out what those errors are and tried to actively sort of improve and make sure that those are minimized.
Yeah.
I want to touch on something at the end of our conversation here. I mean, you brought it up at the start. We spoke about intelligence, and we've been talking a lot about artificial intelligence. Intelligence, it obviously has an effect on the human spirit, intelligence per se, and AI, and the effects on how humans perceive themselves. And I think this relates back to, the purpose and identity of humanity, and that it's something to do with our intelligence. It stems back to obviously a lot of Greek philosophers and what they believed. Do you think that in externalizing our intelligence and improving it, if it's possible as well, beyond human intelligence, that we're then making ourselves maybe second-class beings to our own creation?
That's a really good question. Actually, I really like that. I think that's a very philosophical, abstract question. I do like that. This is something that a lot of people in philosophy and in this field have spoken about, and it's one that's hard to answer. Is AI necessarily or more intelligent than us, or is it? Are we putting too much? I guess, like I was saying, too much. What's the word? Fame onto AI, almost giving it way too much more credit than it deserves. I think ultimately, yes, automation of things, and they've given the examples of AI reading. I think it was like law text within seconds, and that would take lawyers hours and hours to read, and kind of defining as so that's way more intelligent, or that's the AI is so much better than the human. Not necessarily. In the end, it's just really automating processes, I think, enabling humans to make, I guess, more efficient decisions. Like I was saying, not always is that the correct way, but I think the intelligence that humans have cannot be put into a machine. I think that some argue that it can and it will, and that the argument of robots taking over the world or computers, but I personally don't believe that the type of intelligence we have in our brain cannot be put into a computer. And I think that's maybe coming from, like, again, the ethical, good and bad, moral understanding, human nature cannot be put into a machine, because even they've had the examples recently of models where they've put into the moral understanding. So plugging into the model, is it good to kill someone? And the model's like, no. Is it good to do this? And it starts giving ratings kind of yes, no, but it doesn't have an actual understanding. They've just labeled data, and I think that's the problem. I think it's maybe giving too much credit to AI. Not saying that AI doesn't help us and isn't amazing in some aspects, but to me it's not the same as human intelligence.
Mm-hmm. Is that because, like, would you say that there's then a component of the emotive that's wrapped into intelligence that can't be trained?
Yeah, I think it's also like contextualization. Like we're able with our brains to understand the context of things and the context of language, the context of the world, whereas the computer and a model is only able to understand. I say understand in quotations because I don't think it can understand. It's only able to do what it's trained to do, really, and then obviously it can automate and get better, and obviously it can do some amazing things now, but it's not able to understand in the way we are, which is, it's getting into this philosophy rabbit hole, but
it reminds me of that film as well. If you watch the film Ex Machina.
Yes, I love that film.
Yes, I mean, it's a very sort of famous film where there's the whole philosophical debate around if she's able to fall in love or not, or if she's able to understand the situation. And at the end, she obviously makes a decision that you might not have expected she would have, because of her previous decisions that she was trained to make. So it is, for anyone listening that's not watched it, it's maybe a good path to follow after listening to this. Sort of watch that film and see if you can make up your own mind.
Yeah. There's also one on Channel 4 years ago called Humans. It's a similar type one. It's a series, but it's about these kind of robots that look like humans, and then there's a part about relationships and, you know, an actual human potentially falling in love with one, and, you know, whether they can feel and understand. And the other one is Her. I don't know if you've seen that film Her, where the guy has a relationship with the robot over the phone, basically. But I won't give everything away. But
no, I've not heard of that one. Maybe I should look at that one as well.
Yeah, these are all ones that when I was doing my dissertation, everyone was like, "Oh, you need to watch that." And of course, what's his name? Charlie things. Black Mirror. Black Mirror is always
yes.
Black Mirror is always a good one.
That is true. And did you have any conclusions after watching all of those, or did they pertain to what you've just shared?
Kind of pertained, I think. Yeah, I think some of the conclusions, I think they reiterated to me more the fact that it's an interesting idea to explore, that, you know, could you have a relationship with a robot? Could you feel, you know, I guess almost like how you do with a pet, with a robot, but taking it to that level of giving it a human identity. And I, again, came away feeling like I personally don't see that as something I just don't see it the same as having a relationship with a human.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's the whole role of intelligence, and maybe the segmentation of what is intelligence and what belongs to intelligence, and all the different types of intelligence. And for me as well, I mean, I think that the ability to emotionally interpret and emotionally engage in a situation, it belongs highly to what is classified or what could be determined as intelligence, or being regarded as intelligent.
Exactly, yeah. And I guess our humanity in general, I think human nature is like one thing that, you know, even, I guess, if you compare us to animals, we are still different beings, and then comparing it to machine, it's man-made, so it's completely different. They're not able to have feeling. So, I mean, people argue they do, so this is my opinion. But I don't think that we'll ever have a time where machines have actual feeling like humans and animals.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah. It's fascinating. It's been fascinating. But we're sort of out of time today. Maybe we can take up another discussion on another episode. But I want to thank you for your participation and for sharing your insights with us today. It's been valuable. Would you like to share any parting words or anything else with the audience?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. It's been really fun, and some really great philosophical questions. It's nice to actually have these conversations to do with philosophy, because I don't often actually get to do these more abstract ideas and understanding. I don't really talk about it as much anymore. I'm more focused on the AI ethics principles these days, so it's nice to have this kind of discussion. And I think, anyone who's interested in learning more, feel free to reach out to me, because I think I'm always open to having these kinds of conversations with people about philosophy or AI ethics. So yeah, thank you so much.
No, thank you. So I want to thank everyone else for listening today. And if you want to find out more about Squirrel in the Insight Engine, then go to the Squirrel Academy on learn.squirrel.com and access our